You're listening to the second season of the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on Genesis. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders, and across from me is Dr. Paul Wegner. He's going to give us the Hebrew word of the day.
And here we go. I knew you really wanted it today.
Yeah.
And we're gonna do the. We've already talked about covenant already.
Yeah.
And now we're gonna go back and explain the word.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. On this one, Genesis 15:18 says, "On that day the Lord made a covenant." That's the word we're after.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's the Hebrew word berith.
Berith.
And the covenant was the strongest way for a person to know someone else would keep their promise. And that's basically why this whole next part we're going to talk about is so crucial.
Yeah.
Because Abraham's going to, we're going to get into it, but Abraham's going to ask, how can I know that I'm going to have these promises you made me? And God says, well, here's how I do it. I'll make a covenant with you.
So when you say it's the strongest, does that mean like it's the most formal, or is this kind of like a legal understanding? How many levels does this kind of contain in it?
Well, it's at least formal, but I actually would think it's also legal. And at this point, it might even be religious because they're calling God into the commitment that he's making. And so at some point, he's even going to have to swear that he'll keep his part of the bargain.
Right.
So it's not only legal, but religious and all of that.
Yeah.
All those elements stuck together.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a neat word. And I think this makes a lot of sense in what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, okay.
All right. We've already talked about, remember last time we talked about making a covenant and the 4 different parts. We had the promise last week, and we pretty much talked through how the covenants relate to that promise.
Yes. Yeah.
And then now we're going to go right into the Abrahamic covenant and see how it is laid out and how it's explained. So, and as you can see, we've already talked about the one part. Now we're going to talk about the covenant enactment, then the covenant sign, and then the covenant oath in chapter 22.
Okay.
Okay?
That sounds good.
Oh, and last week we talked about that that Abraham is about 75 when he comes out of Haran.
Yeah.
And he's over 100 when he finally goes to offer Isaac up on as a sacrifice. Remember that? So at that point now, so this covenant has taken more than 25 years to
be completed. Is that how you would say it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or agreed upon or something.
Yeah.
Or
it's kind of funny. I've never seen any covenant that was spread out over so much time.
Yeah. That's extensive.
Yeah, and yet he can still call it a covenant because remember last when we talked about that last verse, it said, "I am going to make a covenant with you," and then that was in chapter 15. So it's been in the process, but I assume it's going to. We know that it's going to take to the oath before it's finalized.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So, and remember in Genesis 12, it had 3 parts, the land, the nation, and the blessing.
Yes.
And then we had those covenants that went along with those.
Yeah, they kind of, I think you said it explained it, or kind of teases it out in a way.
Well, and even more, it kind of monitors it.
Yes.
Yeah, how is it going to work out? And that's kind of what those do.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're going to go. Oh, and then we talked about whether it's covenantal.
A little bit of both, right? It's conditional and unconditional.
Well, how did I explain it? Because it's actually pretty important.
I don't remember.
Okay. Okay, if you think about it, it's the only part that's conditional is the promise, where God is making
the
this
initial
promise to Abraham. And if Abraham wants to have this covenant, then he has to do these things. Once he admits that he wants to have a covenant, then God takes over and it's unconditional.
Yeah.
So I would actually say that there's no doubt about this. It's an unconditional covenant. The conditional part was, does Abraham want to have this covenant with him? And that's like in every covenant. If you don't want to have
it's really the initial decision that is the condition.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. So that's why, because you see parts that look a little of both, but it really is just him making a decision whether he wants to make this covenant or not.
And that's really only conditional for Abram too.
Yeah. Yeah.
The descendants they're in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, if they obey, they're in, right?
Yeah. That sounds conditional to me.
Well, remember, even in that Abrahamic, you get to the Davidic covenant, and he says that I'm not going to take this covenant away from you. Your sons are going to be on there, but when they disobey, I'm going to bring people in to punish them. Yeah. So that's kind of how it works.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I thought was interesting too. Do you remember when Abraham leaves, he takes Lot with him?
Yeah.
Yeah. So at that point, too, it sounds like he's not really obeying God. But it seems like to me that what probably is happening, do you remember Haran had died?
Yeah.
So that means that Lot's pretty much on his own. And so I think Abraham, being the responsible brother, son of Terah that he is, takes his nephew,
right?
With him, and because I think he's worried that nobody's going to take care of him.
Yeah.
So I think what's happening is that Abraham's doing a very noble thing, but it's still not quite exactly what God had requested of him. So I actually think in chapter 13, when God separates them, remember at that point, let's just read a little.
Yeah.
So Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev, and his wife, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver and gold, and he went on his journeys from Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent was been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. Now Lot went with Abram, so he had flocks and herds and tents, and the land could not sustain them while they were dwelling together, for their possessions were great, and they were not able to remain together. So do you see the one thing that's happening is if he was worried that Lot couldn't sustain himself and take care of himself, now it's not a problem.
Yeah.
God has so blessed both of them that Lot's got enough, and they've got so many that they can't even live together. So it seems like what God's doing is he's actually forcing
A separation.
an intentional one, and now Abraham doesn't have to worry about Lot.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think that's so at this point, God now has Abraham on his own. My understanding was that God didn't intend to bless both of them. He had intended to bless Abraham, so he had to remove Lot from them so that could happen.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Oh, there's the rest of it, but I think we now know.
Yeah.
So both Abraham and Lot were so wealthy the land couldn't support them both. So Lot chooses the land towards the Jordan River, remember that? And then Abraham took the land west of the Jordan.
Yeah.
And that's even kind of an interesting thing, because you would have thought that Abraham would have had the pick of the lot, because he was the older person, first of all, but he's the more responsible one, taking care of Lot and all that. But it's interesting. He gives Lot the first choice.
He kind of defers to that.
Yeah. So
that is interesting.
That is interesting, because you wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah.
All right. Now, there's a couple issues that are a problem that I need to talk about.
Okay.
Can you go to Genesis 14?
Yes.
And Abraham in verse 13 is called a Hebrew. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Now remember, the Hebrew nation's not even around yet.
Right.
So what does this mean?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the first one is it could be he from the line of Eber, and that word Eber is the same word as Hebrew in the Hebrew language.
Yeah.
Or it's got the same
radicals
consonants.
or whatever.
Yeah. He could be a Habiru. Okay. They were marauding bands at that time and later.
Hibiru meaning like a group of people, or is it like a term for like a marauder or something like that?
Well, it seems to be a group of people when they're in the Amarna letters.
Okay.
But I think it's because all these people are kind of doing the same thing. They've been moved from their own land and gone into another land and are taking property and stuff.
Yeah.
Now, the other side is that the word Eber can mean from the other side. And so it's possible that it means he's from the other side of the Euphrates River.
Yeah.
I've even got a picture here. Do you see? There's the Euphrates River, and Haran would have been between there, the Tigris and Euphrates River. So that would fit really well too.
Yeah. So because he was going west.
Yeah. Okay. It's interesting. In Genesis 10, verse 21, it says, and also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber. And Eber is later on down in the line. He's a person.
Yeah.
So you're going, what is this?
Yeah.
Well, I actually have a PhD student that's working on this.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I have a feeling all three of these may be right. Depending on the context and what's getting at.
Okay.
But I think
because all these would be true.
Yeah, they'd all be
descriptions
true.
of him, essentially.
Yeah. And I think he's part of the line of Eber. And that's probably initially what it's getting at, especially in this verse.
Yeah.
But he's also from the other side, and that may be how people would have known him.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So we'll have to wait and see what she comes up with.
Yeah.
But
That's fascinating.
Yeah,
That's very interesting.
The topic is amazing, because I didn't even think about it at first, but it's a tough one.
Well, because I guess probably most people read this.
Yeah.
And it just sounds Like it's something we already know
Yeah.
is of Abraham, but it is weird to think like this is the first time he's called this, and where would that title come from?
And people that understand like a JDP theory, that would be real easy for them because
Like someone reinsert
this could be a late text, and that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But for us who don't believe that, it's harder to see why that would work.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So anyway, that I thought was fun. And there's one more. In Genesis 14:14, it says that he's chasing these people as far as Dan. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Dan's not even called Dan yet. In fact, if you look at like the Joshua 19:47, it actually calls it Leshem.
That same area.
The same place.
Yeah.
Because then later it says, and then they called Leshem Dan after the name of their forefathers.
Oh, yeah. So it wouldn't have been named yet.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. That sounds right.
Yeah.
And then in Judges, verses 18 through 29, you've got a similar thing, only now it's called Laish. And so it says, and they named it after Dan, their father, who was born in Israel. However, the name of the city formerly was Laish. So what is the name of this place?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, let's take care of a smaller problem. Okay.
Leshem and Laish.
Yeah, Leshem and Laish. Notice that they have two consonants or root radicals that are the same.
Yeah.
I'm not actually sure what language this is in. I know that sounds funny, but remember, Hebrew, the earliest we know of for sure is around the 1400s, somewhere in there. So now remember, this is probably even earlier than that. So the question is what language did Moses initially write in? Or even if this is probably even earlier than that, what language would those two terms been in?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so first I want to let you know that. But second, that mem is probably a memation, which is in Semitic languages, sometimes a mem is put on the end to let you know it's a name or a noun. So I'm wondering if that is probably just memation to show you that.
Which would mean the other two radicals are the exact same, basically, between these two terms.
Now, there is one other problem, but do you see okay, now we're going to have to go into Hebrew for this one. Sorry. Do you see that the lamed has a sagol under it? And then the lamed has a pathic and then a yod and then a hirik.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of combination is probably going to overrule. Back at that time, if sometimes they would just put consonants in, and they're called matras lectiones.
Okay.
It's called mothers of reading. But there would have been that consonant would be in there to tell you it's an I or an E class.
Okay.
And so that would fit then because a sagol is in the E class. So in English, we have 5 vowels, right?
Yeah.
But in Hebrew, they only have 3 classes. One is A, and then EI are together.
That's like one
Class, and then OU are together. So in their minds, the EI would have been the same. So whether they said it was Laish or Leshem, it would have probably been the same. Now remember, if it's not in Hebrew, they're trying to mirror what the
it's almost
sound
a transliteration
was.
or something kind of.
Yeah, that's what I figured. So that could be the problem with those. Okay? So I'm just saying that they're probably very, very similar terms. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, that doesn't deal with the difficult one, though.
Right.
Okay, so why is Dan called Dan 600 years before it's called Dan? That's our problem. And Abraham's about 2000 BC, and Joshua is about 1400. So that's like 600 years between them. So how can that happen?
Yeah.
I actually believe that it's a copyist that came in and updated the name. And so remember, the biblical text is going to be copied for hundreds of years. And I think that probably what was happening is that they got to that place and a scribe realized, we don't call it Laish anymore. We call it Dan.
Yeah.
And so I think they changed it.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think it would have seemed like an error to them. See, they're really careful with the biblical text.
Yeah.
But they would have seen that as something that would kind of confuse people. So I could see why they would change it to the name that it comes. Like in Chicago, I used to live there, and it's called the Windy City.
Yeah.
But if you before that term came around, if somebody called it Chicago and they didn't know that it was later called the Windy City, it wouldn't make any sense. But then once it happened, once it becomes Windy City, then it would be hard for them to remember, oh, yeah, that's Chicago.
Yeah.
So it's possible that those kind of things could have just been up to clarify the text.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably what's going on there.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, we got two difficulties out of the way now.
Yeah.
All right. Then Genesis 15 is, I would say this is the second part of the covenant, and it's called the covenant enactment. And basically, it's a ceremony where the people, the person who's responsible for the covenant is going to walk through the pieces. Do you remember the animals cut in half? Cut in half. I've got this. First of all, in verse 1, it actually says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you, and your reward will be very great. And Abram said, O Lord, what will you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? That's actually kind of interesting.
Yeah.
He's what's going to happen is that whoever's the oldest born person in the house. So he's a slave, and yet he was born in his house. So that means he's the one that's going to be the heir.
Yeah.
Now for Abraham, that's not good enough. He
wants an heir.
Yeah. Okay, that's possible, and I'll pass off my wealth to him. But I want somebody from my own womb, from my own body.
Yeah.
And so Abraham said, since thou hast given me no offspring to be born, one born in my house is my heir. So that's Eliezer of Damascus. All right. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man will not be your heir, but the one who comes forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. See, that's what Abraham wanted, right? Somebody from his own body to be his heir. Okay. And he took him outside and said, look towards the heavens and count the stars if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And then he believed in the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. But my response is, well, what did he believe? Well, I assume it's what God just told him, that he was going to have an heir, and that he's going to have so many children that they're going to be like the stars in the heaven. Yeah. Now, remember, so when we read that, we want to say, oh, well, he believed in Jesus, right? Well, but that context wouldn't even suggest that. Right. And so Abraham is going to believe in God, but I think it's because he understands, and he's in the process of learning about God still. Sure. So I think that's what he believes, and now he's going to learn that this God is going to make a covenant with him. Yeah. Okay?
Now, let me ask you something.
Sure.
Would Lot have potentially been a better heir than Eleazar from Damascus?
Yeah, maybe, and maybe that's why God removed him.
Separation, maybe,
because at least he is in his own family line. Yeah, so that's probably true. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have that's the enactment.
Yeah, not yet. Hang on. Oh. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to possess it. So he's making sure he knows. Here's the. Remember, I told you in the covenants they kind of have a history of the relationship behind him. So he's given Abraham the history that he was the one that did all this. Mm-hmm. And he says, "Oh Lord God, how may I know that I may possess it?" Now that's actually a really good question, because in the Hebrew it could go two ways. It could mean, so notice it, how may I know? So that's one of the questions, but the other one could be, when will I know? So it's, the Hebrew is the word ki in Hebrew, and it can have either meaning. Yeah. So it's almost neat, because what God's going to do is he's going to give them both answers, and I'll show you that in a minute. Okay. Okay? All right. So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. Mm-hmm. And then he's going to get ready to make this covenant. So remember, he cuts them in half except for the birds and lays them on the side. Yeah. And then God's going to walk through. Got a little picture here. So the animals are on both sides, okay? Now, verse 10. Then he brought these two to him and cut them in two and laid each half opposite each other. But he did not cut the birds. And the birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abraham drove them away. Now, people have said those birds are adversaries to the covenant and all that. I just think they're birds. I mean, that's, you see dead animals on the ground. Sure. Those are going to be. So I'm not real convinced that you can read too much into what they are. Yeah. Okay. Now, when the sun went down, a deep sleep came over Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell on him. And God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. They will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. Notice he's now giving him the when. Yeah. Okay. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterwards they will come out with many possessions. And as for you, you will go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried at a good old age. Then in the fourth generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So notice there's a couple things that I think are really important here. So first of all, he's saying fourth generation, and he had said it's 400 years. So they understood a generation to be 100 years. Now, usually what that was is the time from a father to have a son.
Yeah.
And so that time period, and then the generation would start. So I'm kind of surprised that that's a long time for a generation. But
Yeah.
I just thought I'd let you see that because that's pretty important.
Yeah. I mean, that's even longer than what Abraham experiences, right?
Yeah, he's going to be dead by that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, even like a generation. I mean, it takes a long time for him to have an heir,
right.
but it's less than 100 years.
Yeah, for him, yeah. Now, notice it also says, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. You know, you almost always are going to get some student that'll ask me, why is God so cruel that he wipes out women and children and everything of the Canaanites? This verse actually helps me because it's saying that when God sent Abraham through the first time, he didn't say to wipe out all the Canaanites because the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. So that must mean that when Moses comes through the second time, 400 years later, the sin is complete and God can actually have them punished. So I think that actually helps me because then this isn't a real cruel God. This is a God who's judging and punishing people that are now have got their iniquity filled all the way up and now they need punishment.
Yeah.
So that's sometimes helpful for people.
Sure.
Because they don't understand that.
Yeah.
All right. Now, here's the answer to both his questions. So this is the temporal part. And then right after this,
we get the why.
Well, right after this, God's going to walk through the parts of the animal.
Oh,
now when that happens, that's him taking the curses. What that means is, you see those animals? I'm going to make myself like those if I don't keep my part of the bargain. So he's walking through the parts, saying, "I'm taking these."
That's
curses.
the symbolism of
it.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
And this is the actual enactment.
Yes.
This is like the procedure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Abraham is starting to question God's promises, and Eliezer Damascus is his heir. So that's the part that now God wants to say, no, that's not true. You're going to have your own child. God then reconfirms his promises, especially land and nation, okay? And then the covenant is the strongest way for them to confirm one's word. So God's saying, I'll become like these animals, dead, if I don't keep my part of the bargain. Now imagine, here God saying, I'm going to kill myself.
Yeah.
He's the only one that could actually hold him responsible for that.
Yeah.
But he's all-knowing, so he knows he's going to keep the part of the bargain.
Yeah.
So that's really good. Then a smoking oven and flame torches were the picture of God going through. I assume he got those from, remember on Mount Sinai when they saw God? They saw flashes of lightning and the smoke.
Yeah.
So I think they're taking that image to say, now I've already shown you my image of what I'm like up there. Now I'm going to walk through this parts. So I think that was why. I want to show you one other thing.
Yeah.
In Jeremiah, I've got it up here. So this is Jeremiah 34. And it says, this is another place where the covenant enactment actually happens. And because most people don't know that there's another place that one of these things actually took place. Because you know about the Genesis 15, but this other one is less known about. It says, I will give the men who have transgressed my covenant, who have not fulfilled the words of the covenant which they made before me. Notice this is a covenant in God's name.
Yeah.
Okay. When they cut the calf into and passed between its parts. So this one apparently was just a calf, but it's the same kind of image, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The officials of Judah, the officials of Jerusalem, the court officers, the priests, and all the people of the land who pass between the parts of the calf. And I will give them into the hand of their enemies and into the hand of those who seek their life, and their dead bodies will be food for the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth. Do you see what he's saying? God is the one now holding them responsible for this covenant that he's making.
And they're the ones that walked through it, basically.
Yes.
They made that same level of commitment.
Yes.
But failed to.
Yeah, to keep their part of the bargain,
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
That's very interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Now, verse 13 actually says that they're going to have 400 years of captivity.
Yeah.
And back, if you go to Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, it actually says technically it was 430. So I assume that's just a round number. at this point.
Yeah.
Okay. And then in the 4th generation, Abraham's nation will return to Canaan. So that's part of the history also, that they will return, and that's they'll get the land then.
Yeah.
And we already talked about the generation.
100 years.
Now, one other thing is it says the land that he gives them is from the river of Egypt, and that's not the Nile. It's usually it's a wadi that's at the very bottom of Israel. And so on this side is Egypt, on this side is Israel.
Okay.
But it's not the Nile River.
Yeah.
There's another Hebrew word for that.
For the Nile.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. To the Euphrates. Okay. So it's going all the way up to the Euphrates River.
Yeah.
And I would actually say that during Solomon's time, they actually controlled all that area. Now, if you look at the promise in Genesis 15, I'll just read just a little more of it. Verse 18. On the day that the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. The Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, and the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, and all the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So he basically goes through and explaining all those little tribes that are in there.
That's going to be your space.
Yeah. So my understanding that he gave that land to him probably when Solomon was reigning, because through alliances and stuff, he had all that area.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if God has to do it again. I think he could if he wants to. But I don't think he has to give all that land to them again.
Yeah.
So the issues we're having with the Palestinians and the Israelites in the land of Israel today, I don't know that this passage has anything to say about that.
Yeah.
He already gave them the land. He can do it again, but I don't know that he has to.
Yeah.
So it's an issue that I think the biblical text doesn't help answer.
Kind of solved in a way, or could be.
Yeah, I would say it's already been solved.
Yeah, it's in the
probably.
past. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, I'm sorry. So that was chapter 15, and in 15 now we've got. It's kind of neat because now we've got God saying, "All right, I'm giving you this land. I told you when it was going to happen, and now you know because I've walked through the parts." Okay.
Yeah.
Now. So but it's still not over yet, right?
Yeah.
We've still got several chapters of information that's going to happen, and if that was, let's say that's 85, Abraham's at 85, it's still another 15 years before it happens.
Yeah.
And I think what happens is Abraham and Sarah get. So they're thinking, what's going on? Why hasn't it happened yet? So I think that they've lost their patience. I think they're ready to now get on with this.
Yeah.
And I think that's what chapter 16 is. So that's Hagar.
It does
and
make
Sarah.
a little more sense out of that.
Yeah, because remember, at that point now, they've waited now a good 10 years after God's made this promise, and still nothing to show for it.
Yeah.
So Abraham then, I think, and Sarah, it's time to take things into their own hands, I think. And so Ishmael's there. And it's interesting, in that passage, he says, if only Ishmael could live before you. And God says, no, I've told you there's going to be somebody from your line, and not from you and a maidservant, but you and your wife, Sarah.
Yeah.
And he made that real clear.
Yeah.
So that's what I think what 16 is all about.
Yeah.
And then in 17, we get the sign of circumcision.
And this is the third element of the covenant.
And on
sign.
this, once again, it's kind of important. In chapter 17, I want to just read just a little for you.
Yeah.
It says, now when Abraham was 99 years old, so realize so it's at least 13 years after the last time he had talked to him.
Yeah.
So I can see why Abraham and Sarah getting impatient.
Yeah.
Right? And I could see why 16 would happen.
Yeah.
So he's waited all this time, and Abraham's not getting any younger, right? And remember, him and Sarah haven't been able to have children all this time. So you can imagine they're thinking it's almost impossible. That's what, like in chapter 18, when those angels come and tell him that he's going to have a son, and Sarah laughs. Well,
Right.
I could see why poor Sarah, she hasn't been able to have a child for 90 years, and now when she's 90 years old, she's going to have a child.
Right.
So I think she's thinking that's too good to be true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
and if he's 99, that actually does make him pretty close to that generation.
Yeah. Right.
That was closer than I thought it was.
Yeah. Okay, look at verse 17, verse 1. And when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. That's that word El Shaddai. You've probably heard of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant with you, between me and between you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Abraham fell on his face, and God talked to him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer will your name be called Abram. Remember, we talked about that last time?
Yeah.
All right. But your name will be Abraham, for I will make you a multitude of nations. And then he goes on and he tells him that Sarah's name is going to change also. So from Sarai to Sarah. And that's, I think that's just an update of the name because both of them actually mean princess. So I think it's an update.
Yeah.
So that's, again, kind of the background.
Yeah.
So in here, what we've got is what is going to happen is we've got a question of he's 100 years old, he's going to be circumcised, and that will be a sign. Now, covenants don't need signs, but a lot of times they do have them. Like the covenant with creation, remember back in Genesis 9, God gave them the rainbow to remind them. And this one, there's other ones that are signs that are included, but I think this one actually helps them to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Okay?
Well, and a sign is for remembering.
Yeah.
Right?
And so
which it
that's-
seems like
Yeah.
they've forgotten maybe, judging by what happened in chapter 16.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. Well, and circumcision is going to be really important because remember, Moses is not going to do it, and he almost gets killed for it.
Right.
So we'll look at that, I'm sure, later too.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So we've got the sign of circumcision. All right. I'm going to skip the next slide because we're going to have to have a whole one on that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
A whole episode?
Yeah, we'll have to skip
okay.
that.
Okay.
And this one. I want to go to chapter 22. All right, in Genesis 22, now we're going to have the covenant oath. So this will be the fourth part. So we had the promise, we had the covenant enactment, we've got the covenant sign, and now we've got the oath. Okay? He tells him to take his son to Mount Moriah and offer him there. Actually, at that point, he doesn't actually tell him where it is, but he says, to a place where I will show you.
Yeah.
And then after 3 days walk, he actually gets there. So if you look there, he was in Beersheba when that promise was given. He's going up to, actually, that's the old term for Jerusalem, Shalom. Salam.
Yeah, it's like the last two consonants.
So basically what's happening there is he's going up to there, and in 2 Chronicles, it actually tells us, here I've got it here, 3:1 says, and Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. So it actually equates them.
Yeah.
Where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place where David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So remember what happened. He had bought that threshing floor, but he couldn't build the temple yet.
Yeah.
And so it's equating the same places.
Yeah.
So that's kind of neat.
It is, yeah.
Okay. And Abraham now has learned to trust in this God he serves. So he's got over 25 years of God showing him that he can protect him and all of this.
Yeah.
And so he's finally starting to get it, I think. And then this is finally the last part of the covenant to make it complete.
Yeah.
And you can imagine that an oath is usually how most covenants or even agreements end, right? They swear that they'll keep they'll be truthful and
like signing a document or something. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so the covenant oath is offering up Isaac. On the third day, Abraham saw Mount Moriah, and he took his son on ahead. Remember, he leaves the servants.
Yeah.
The dreaded question then comes, God will provide for himself an offering. I bet Abraham was waiting for poor Isaac to, obviously the kid's smart enough to know they don't have a sacrifice to go up there.
Right.
Okay, and that's when God swears in verse 15. Here's what it says. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and not withheld your son, your only son, I will greatly bless you. I will greatly multiply your seeds as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. And in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you've obeyed my voice. Notice, did you see it's picking up all those elements that were in chapter 12 and now highlighting them again?
Yeah.
So he's saying now. And when I was a THM student, I actually did a thesis on when God swears, So here, God is swearing by himself.
Yeah.
And in that context, usually when God swears by either, there's other contexts, but once by himself. And when he does that, it's because he's got no one higher to hold him responsible for.
Right.
So he's swearing by himself because he knows he's going to keep it.
Yeah.
And sometimes he'll swear by the pride of Jacob. And in that context, the pride of Jacob was really something that was highlighted in that context.
Yeah.
So it's usually something in that context. And here I'm swearing by myself.
By my own name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's basically what now is being added to the covenant. So God wanted Abraham's obedience, not the life of Abraham. Remember,
Or the life of Isaac.
Isaac. I mean,
Yes.
he stops him.
Yeah.
And so I think that becomes really crucial.
Yeah.
Abraham still is about learning about his God because he didn't know necessarily that God didn't want child sacrifice. Right?
Sure,
He could
yeah.
assume he's like all the pagan gods that want
Yeah.
that same thing.
Yeah.
But now when God stops him, I think he learns, oh, this God doesn't necessarily want his life. And I think that becomes really important. And later on, you're going to find out that God does not want human sacrifice. And he makes sure, humans sacrificed. And he makes sure that they know that.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important.
Yeah.
So that's basically our last thing, and here's our conclusions. So God wants Abraham to know that he will keep his covenant. And the best way to do that in his mind is to make a covenant with him.
Yeah.
And so Abraham, because he lives in a society where covenants were known about and all like that, it would make perfect sense to him.
Yeah.
Okay? All right, Abraham had to keep demonstrating faith all the way through his life. So God was testing him all the way through to
years.
make sure he's going to obey. And then what would seem like to me the highest thing he could do would be to offer his son. Because remember, he had waited now 25 years for this child to actually come.
Right.
And so now God asks for the very thing that he is most dear to him.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important.
And it's not just that it's, of course it's true that it's his, dear son or whatever, but it's also what you would assume would be the mechanism for the rest of this covenant too.
Yeah.
How else can you have all these descendants?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And remember, he reminds him of all those before he makes the oath too.
Right.
Yeah. All right. It took over 25 years to complete the covenant. And I think that's amazing because often you don't even think about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then God was working with Abraham a long time and bringing obstacles into his life and everything. But at every point, God had overcome those obstacles so that this promise could happen.
Yeah.
Even when Abraham asked him, "Can't you do it an easier way? like take Ishmael and do it with him?" And God says, God's going, "I don't need an easier way. I know exactly how I'm going to do it."
Yeah.
Which I think is amazing.
It is. Yeah.
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 Well, any questions? Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, that's a lot too. I mean, really, these last two topics have been pretty. I mean, they're of course connected because they're on the covenant, but it's a lot. It's a lot to go over. But I do think that brings a lot of light into something that maybe is culturally confusing. That isn't as clear.
And I think what's interesting is that there's another passage in Scripture where God, people walk through the parts of the animal, because that one we almost nobody knows about, but it's almost a similar kind of thing.
Right. Right.
So,
no, it's fantastic.
Well,
very good.
Oh, I already gave a hint about what's kind of next.
Yeah. Why don't you give us a little bit about that?
I think we'll talk about the angel of the Lord. And we'll also find out about Melchizedek. Those are issues we've...
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah,
those are good.
We purposely skipped over them because I thought we'd need a whole session on them.
Okay. That sounds good.
Well, keep watching.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.